Hi, my name is Natalia Serparra Diaz. I'm a Communications and Spanish double major at the College of Worcester, and I am a part of Class of 2021. The title of my independent study is A Continuación, Black Lives Matter, an ethnographic analysis of the perception of the Latinx community towards the Black Lives Matter movement. My advisors were Dr. Rohini Singh in the Communications Department and Professora Rebecca Goronzik in the Spanish Department. My study examines the attitudes of the Latinx community in the United States towards the African American community in the Black Lives Matter movement. Specifically, I wanted to analyze how the amount of Spanish speaking news media watched by the Latinx interviewee might affect the perception of the African American community and the Black Lives Matter movement. Specifically, why I was interested in this topic was through my attendance of the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer of 2020, I saw such an overwhelming amount of support of the Latinx community in the streets. But then when I watched the Spanish-speaking news media, I saw a bit of a different type of rhetoric that was more was informative, yet a little bit focused on the violence of the movement. So I was intrigued to see how this might affect how the Latinx community perceives the African American community through the amount of news media, specifically Spanish speaking news media that they watched. The three vocabulary terms that are important to understand are mestizaje, frames of criminality surrounding the African American community, and Hispanic oriented media. Mestizaje literally means the mixture of the races. This term dates back all the way to colonization in Latin America. Of course, through slavery and colonization and discrimination, a lot of communities were mixed and there was a lot of interracial children. And in turn, this caused for the Latinx community to be very mixed. Yet, the term mestizaje was used to kind of homogenize that racial identity and in turn exclude African American communities and indigenous communities in the narrative. Yet, the Latinx community has a lot of influence from the African community and the indigenous community. So in turn this term influences how Hispanic people view race. They view race more of a in the sense of a spectrum as opposed to a black white binary that as is seen in the United States. The frame of criminality surrounding the African American community can date back to the civil rights movement. These frames only portray African American people and individuals when they have committed a crime or been victims of a crime. In turn, these negative frames blame the African American community for their marginalization of this community, when in reality, it's a result of racism and systematic racism. But in turn, these news frames blame and demonize the African American community to the extent that they are not included in the overall American narrative. Instead, they are seen as outsiders, even though they form so much of the American society today and American culture. Hispanic oriented media is the news media, not just news media, but all the Spanish speaking media that is targeted to Spanish speakers and people of the Latinx community in the United States. This Hispanic oriented media, I specifically speak about Hispanic oriented news media, has been criticized for homogenizing the Hispanic community to make them an easier target for sales. They have also been criticized for using American news media as their only source to provide news information to its audience. In turn, this might have an effect, this direct correlation of Hispanic oriented news media with the frames of criminality surrounding the African American community and the perception of mestizaje of the Latinx community has an effect on how the Latinx community views the African American community, because most of the immigrant community's perception of the African American community comes directly from Hispanic oriented news media as opposed to real life encounters. The method of my study was to interview 10 Latinx or Hispanic Americans who have lived in the United States from 2012 to 2020. Then, in the interviews, I asked about the participants' ideas, values, and attitudes towards the African American community. And then I analyzed these interviews and grouped common beliefs and values of the Latinx community towards the African American community and the Black Lives Matter movement. There were 10 participants in total in my study, and their demographics were very diverse. Out of the 10 participants, 10 were from Chicago, Illinois, 2 lived in Miami, Florida, and 6 lived in Lawrenceville, Georgia at the time of the interview. Out of the 10 participants, 3 were from the Dominican Republic or had Dominican heritage, 3 were from Mexico or had Mexican heritage, and 4 were from Colombia or had Colombian heritage. Out of the 10 participants, 4 participants were under the age of 30 and 6 participants were above the age of 40. The racial diversity of this group of participants was varied, yet it's hard for me to give a number to the amount or the specific racial identification of my participants due to their diverse self-identification and their rejection of a lot of terms used in the United States to identify race. But I did specify whether they were of light complexion or dark complexion. The results of my study can be divided into 3 tropes of thought. A strong rejection of umbrella terms, a disassociation of the Latino us from the African American other, and a reliance on children to educate immigrant parents about racial justice issues in America. I will specifically focus on the strong rejection of umbrella terms. What I mean by a rejection of umbrella terms, when all of the participants were asked, "What race do you identify with?" they showed either confusion, a direct rejection of the question, or they were hesitant in answering the question. A perfect example of this was the participant Maria, who self-identified as female. She was of light complexion. She was born in Mexico, but lived in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and was under the age of 30. She says, when I asked her what race she identified with, she asked me what race meant to me. And I explained to her that it meant the color of the skin. And she responded with this quote, "That's what I think too, the color of the skin. But it would feel weird to put white. When I was in school to take the exams in high school, I remember that they didn't even give us an option, since they gave you the sheet and they always gave me and my sister white, Hispanic white, Maria." As we continue the interview, Maria explains that she felt uncomfortable to self-identify her race as white because even though she is of a light complexion and her skin is light and white, she felt as if describing herself as of the white race was rejecting and not recognizing the suffering and discrimination she had lived in Georgia as a Latina woman. She described being physically and verbally abused when she worked in a Mexican restaurant due to the fact that she spoke Spanish, due to her ethnicity. So she felt as if, again, if she would self-describe herself as white, it would be like ignoring that discrimination and that past of that she had lived in the United States. Thank you so much for listening to my my presentation. I will be available if you have any questions or thoughts about my study.